professionally and personally, really important to me. And I have nothing to disclose. And then our objectives. So what I hope will be advancing with you here is using inquiry as a tool, identifying characteristics for effective inquiry, and how to construct a good question. We learn how to do a lot, usually around advocacy, but not so much around inquiry. And that to me is a very important piece. I was thrilled to see the faculty development program impactful scholarship diagram here. And the heart of it looks like authenticity and societal context. And I just like to tell you a personal story why this really resonated with me. So my dad died a few years back at age 96. And he was a professor of journalism. And at his memorial, a gentleman came up to me and said, your dad hired me when I was young and just looking for my first faculty position. And he said, I was insufferable. I had all the answers. And your father taught me how to ask the questions, which made all the difference in my personal life and my professional career. And, I started thinking about that probably I'd been mentored around inquiry most of my life, unbeknownst to me, because of the orientation of my dad. So following the burial, we're on our way back from February in Michigan, which is a real stress test if you've ever been there. And we're sitting on the plane and my daughter starts asking me questions about Normandy. And my father was in the Normandy invasion and survived. And he never talked about it. So my ability to respond was pretty sketchy. And there was a gentleman in the seat in front of us who apologized, turned around and said he'd been listening into the conversation. And he wanted me to know that those who survived the Normandy invasion made a pact with one another that they would not talk about it. They would not talk about the suffering, and that they promised to go forward and lead an authentic and a consequential life to make positive impact. So when I saw the center of this, it took me back to my dad. So thank you for that. Next slide. This is a animated Mobius band, Mobius strip, which is a very helpful metaphor for me when we think about this portfolio of work. It represents to me the iterative and mutually reinforcing processes in research, discovery, implementation, innovation, and improvement. The thread that runs through it all is disciplined inquiry. And so if you look at this next slide, it's an attempt to take that Mobius structure and put the different components in it, which I think is critical. And almost at every step, I see your impactful scholarship model playing out. So this is exciting work you're doing. And to me, what's exciting, and the next slide will demonstrate the thoughts here, is that medical research, even research around implementation, has been all based on science and quantitative methods, the gold standard being double-blind studies. But when you start looking at change, environmental change, organizational change, you're moving into an area of profound complexity and messiness because of people and because of the variables that come and go constantly. And so what I see you doing that's very exciting is that your work pulls together and integrates both the sociology of change and inquiry in its broadest context, psychology, human factors, and so on, as well as the quantitative discipline that comes in the medical sciences. So that bridging together and not being one or the other is new ground, I think, and exciting ground, and it is going to have impact. Now to inquiry, which is pictured here, is Naguib Mahfouz, and he's a Egyptian writer, prolific writer, started at age 17, has written 34 novels, 350 short stories, movie scripts, plays, and is a very deep thinker, which brought him the Nobel Prize in 1988 for literature. And he says many wise things, but the one that resonates with me on this topic is you can tell whether a person is clever by the answers, but you can tell whether a person is wise by the questions they ask. And that is like a grounding point for me, and I hope it's helpful to pass on to you. So in the portfolio of inquiry, I think there are some preconditions. And here are the preconditions that I think of, and you may have others. The first is humility. You have to step into a position of admitting you don't know everything and seek to learn more. Genuine curiosity. Social and emotional skills, which we'll talk about a little later as the gateway to learning. And then the context of psychological safety. I know that you work with the notion of psychological safety at UW, but here I'm defining it as cultural freedom from the fear of being wrong, sounding naive, being dismissed, or being diminished, that we either place on ourselves or are placed on by others. So it's the openness. So inquiry, as I'm talking about it today, is appreciative, respectful, creates a path forward. It invites analytic capabilities. Want to be critical and thoughtful. It's the gateway to learning, and it requires modeling and mentoring. And part of this is not just the formulation of the question, but it includes the tone, the pacing, the voice inflections. How do you ask a question without judgment? And what could be completely unconscious inflections in your voice that transmits a meaning that you either meant or did so unintentionally? A good example is what were you thinking? Or, what were you thinking? And it sometimes requires a bit of rehearsal to begin to see what implicit biases you may be carrying around in those questions. Now, inquiry is not the following. We'd like to have open to the floor for shorter speeches disguised as questions. I run into this a lot. I don't know if you ever have, but very often we can't let go of the advocacy. And when you're talking about something you already know, you're not learning anything new. But it is in the process of inquiry and appreciative listening that you're learning. Now, outcomes of appreciative inquiry and effective inquiry are many. And this is to be differentiated from questions that are interrogative. They become like an interrogation, or they're entrapment, or they're manipulative. And I think most of us have been in positions in which inquiry feels like that. It's intended to open versus constrain for greater dialogue and discovery. So it generates curiosity, It stimulates reflective conversations, thoughtful, reflective conversations. It promotes confidence. Asking someone a question, a genuine ask of a question, and listening to their response is a demonstration of respect. And when people feel respected, they gain confidence. And I think this is one of the biggest and strongest interventions in culture we can make. And that is creating the psychological safety of having effective inquiry and moving away from constant advocacy. It invites reframing, creativity, new possibilities, channels attention, and hopefully it should stay with the parties involved, that it connects with some kind of meaning and evokes even more questions. The image that you see in front of you now, the tree, is very often with inquiry, we stay above ground level and are looking at the tree. But with inquiry, you can go deeper and deeper and begin to elicit insights, half-baked ideas, give voice to sensings that you may have, and help others formulate with you a path forward and discover more. There is an author, Thomas Berger, you may know. He was rather controversial in that he's a satirist. One of his novels was Little Bighorn. He came out of Cincinnati and in 1924 and died in 2014. He said the art and science of asking questions is the source of all knowledge. And the right question can substitute candor for not speaking up. And it can create engagement without a fear for being wrong. The next person I'd like to introduce you to on this topic is Amy Edmondson. Amy is a professor at Harvard Business School in leadership and management, and she has many streams of research, including teaming. And notice it's a verb. Team is static, and she sees teaming as an ongoing dynamic skill that requires inquiry. Another area of her focus is psychological safety and organizational success. Her last book, and I'd highly recommend it, is called The Fearless Organization. And it talks about the need for reflection and inquiry in this information economy in order to be successful. Amy is also an artist in teaching case method, and I just so admire every time I see her making things come alive through case method, which is all about the questions, the setup and then the questions. So Amy proposes we think about the following in creating a psychological safety that is a precondition for inquiry-based leadership, inquiry-based scholarship. And there are 3 points, and I'll touch on each one in detail. The first is set the stage. The second is invite engagement. And the third is to respond productively. So let's start with set the stage. Framing has a lot to do with everything. So how you frame the purpose of your work, the purpose of your engagement, the purpose for which you are putting in effort is very important. And you'll find this to be particularly important when we talk about failure and how you can reframe failure as an analytic task and a pathway to innovation and discovery, as opposed to an apoplectic disaster, you know. The next is the language you use. Words matter, so affirming, non-judgmental, and inspiring words, as opposed to words that focus on strictly compliance or doing this for some other purpose than to advance that which is important to you. And having an aim to expose mental models, pursue new ideas, and to be able to challenge and make it clear that challenge is a value without threat. So it's a matter of being kind to people, but tough on ideas. And that people understand the difference. And often you have to just be explicit about that at the beginning, so you're not leaving it to someone's assumptions about whether it's them, the person, or the idea that's being challenged. The next is to invite engagement. When you enter with humility, you're opening up to invite others in. And we mentioned before using questions in terms of always using advocacy, especially in a corporate and academic setting and others. We're used to advocacy for a point of view or for transferring information. And if you're only telling what you already know, you're not learning. And that puts limitations on what is possible. So being able to step back and make sure that there's a balance of both questions and advocacy so that you can enter into authentic dialogue and purposeful inquiry. The other is having genuine curiosity and asking questions that are concrete and aspirational. When I started doing this work in patient safety, we knew that we did not want to harm children, want to eliminate harm. And so I started out in an advocacy mode, and that mode included bringing forward all kinds of research and articles and documents, and I was greeted with the response that that doesn't happen here. We're different. So I quickly realized that advocacy for this point of view to develop a patient safety strategy to do no harm was not going to be successful. So instead started using inquiry, such as, well, what was in the way of you doing the very best you could for your patient yesterday? And pretty soon you heard all these barriers that were in the way or creating unnecessary complexity to clinicians doing their best work. Now, I didn't recognize that as any kind of skilled intervention. I honestly didn't know what the experience there was at Children's. And was it different? Was it the same? What are the nuances? How do we best understand collectively where we are? This was at the time Amy Edmondson was doing a case study for Harvard Business School, and she selected Children's. And we worked with Amy, and she reflected back to me that what I was using was inquiry as a leadership tool. And it was just something that I did intuitively. But as it sunk in, I began to get more disciplined and clear about how one can use inquiry. The other way of inviting engagement is looking for the social and emotional connections. And the Salzburg seminars, global seminars, that's located in Austria, has many global convenings to think deeply about and discover new and better ways for all kinds of work: education, diversity, medicine, social work, the arts. And what they have developed is a new track called SEL, which is the social emotional learning, as a foundation for learning and education, and not an ornamental kind of nice thing to have. I had talked to some of your faculty when I was there, after I was there, and it was now the pandemic and people were separated and working remotely, or certainly not gathering. And one of the big concerns was, what about the social fabric of the practice? And how will that change if we're not sharing food together, we're not gathered in a huddle talking about our life experiences? And I've seen some very creative things coming out of your divisions in terms of how do you keep that social and emotional connection that provides that gateway for people to want to learn more and to be curious. And there also has to be an architecture for learning, for structure, for research, for inquiry, for people to connect and interact. And that structure comes in many forms, and it's responsive to whatever culture or environment you're in. But there has to be a way for people to reach out and connect with one another. It may not happen spontaneously. And the third is to respond productively. So responding is, it may not always be, when you ask a question, what you expected to hear in return, but being appreciative and respectful and using that response as a path forward. Or to take it on as an analytic task. Well, if that is the response, then what? Or what do you make of this? How should we think about it? And then always thank you for the question. If there is inquiry being used inappropriately to interrogate, intimidate, deflate, that needs to be sanctioned and responded to. People need feedback. They may not even recognize that that's what they're up to. And then the most important part of responding productively is acting on what you've heard. So that takes us to the question of learning fast. When you're using inquiry, you're in a dynamic state as opposed to a more traditional business model with strategic planning, goals, tactics, everything lined up in a rather linear fashion. And the one thing I'm always concerned about are these massive rollouts. We're going to do something, now vaccinations is one thing, but let's say a change in processing around a clinical topic or around a delivery of care model. Rollouts are intimidating and often fail. And when they do, it creates this stop. But what if you think about cycling out? So taking chunks and testing and asking the questions in an experimental frame before moving to the next chunk, so that you have the chance to iterate in recovery, celebrate progress that's made, and also consider PDSA cycles You know, small, low fidelity, focused points of inquiry. So this notion of pilots is a very strong one, but it combines both courage and fear, and probably best exemplified by the Cowardly Lion from the Wizard of Oz, right? He was constantly in that courage, fear position. Now, Tom Kelly, who is the CEO at IDEO, he co-founded IDEO with his brother David. And his work is about the art of innovation and getting creative confidence. And what he recommends we all do is to sit back when being confronted with a new project, a new research design, a new model of care, to look at what are you afraid of? Because there's always something. And he said the 4 big things that he runs into when he works with folks around innovation. And he's done a lot of work at Stanford, by the way. So he's familiar too with the medical enterprise. Is the fear of the messy unknown. Because often you don't know what you don't know until you're in the middle of it. The fear of being judged. The fear of the first step. And then the fear of losing control. Because when you're working with pilots, you're really unleashing the talent and the wisdom and the energy of the people closest to the work. And that can go in unexpected ways. Now, another person that's very interesting in this whole area of change and inquiry and psychological safety is Astro Teller, who is the captain of the Moonshot Factory. This was formerly Google X. And his expertise is in the use of intelligent technology and beginning to look at things in different ways. Teller would say, you know, I'm not pro-failing, but get on with it. If you're going to fail, fail fast and know when to cut your losses. But I am pro-learning. So what he does is he always reframes failure as a task to overcome and being part of the analytic process. Now we're back to Amy Edmondson again. So she has spent decades studying organizations. And she is very clear that learning from failure is not controversial. It's known, there's evidence, but so few organizations, whether it's a unit within a hospital setting, whether it's a faculty practice group, whether it's a research team, or whether it's a large organizational system, the ability to understand and tolerate failure is very difficult. And when that is not okay, obviously you don't want to fail at the bedside, right? So you're going to test things very carefully before then. But in terms of making other kinds of changes in delivery and in methods, the world will not come to an end. But yet we judge people and blame them when things don't go exactly as planned. But often it's the plan and not the people and the execution that are the issue. So where and how can you make a difference using inquiry to advance scholarly work? Well, when I looked at the model of your impactful scholarship, part of it was identifying what it is you're going to do. So that could be seen as a strategic decision. where are you going to put your efforts? So instead of strategy being as a linear mapped out plan, you could consider using strategy as learning. And that would look like starting with a framework of guiding principles. What are the principles? What do we want to accomplish? A sense of direction, so that you know you're moving forward and toward. And then as you move forward and toward, your horizon is going to always change and get brighter. So you can have a set of questions that need to be defined, refined, and reiterated and answered as you go along. And there may be some intelligent failure along the way, but that gives you more information to begin to create and look at that cycle again. I fear we've gotten so trapped in our kind of MBA model, rooted in a time and place when change was not as dynamic, variables were not as great, and there was an illusion that you could control everything. But what you are doing are breaking the ground and looking at that isn't the way the world is working, and developing models of inquiry that can better tune to the way the world works and begin to not try to control it, but to understand it and to tame the complexity that is out there. The same thing is true of implementation. So here you might think about formulation versus implementation. And again, with this, it's a general direction. You have a hypothesis. You're going to inform that hypothesis with data and feedback as you test it. You learn, you experiment, and you create. And then you repeat and do it again and just keep going. But the last slide I want to mention is a repeat of one of the first slides, and that is that your work is not looking at either or, but both and when it comes to qualitative and quantitative methods. And that is where the gold is. And that's where you're going to make substantive differences, meaningful differences to those that are dependent upon the healthcare system to